Nice to be here. Thank you, all of you, for coming. What I'm going to do is tell you a little bit about some of my research, and then you can ask me, of course, questions more in depth, and also about other projects that I won't have time to discuss. So, how did I end up doing this? Well, as a little child in Massachusetts, my first experience that I really remember with the natural world was when I was about 5, and some little kids and I were outside, and I guess we saw a black rat snake, and the immediate reaction of everyone was to throw stones at it, except for myself. I was sort of appalled, but just fascinated by this creature. And then shortly after, we moved to Northern California, and I lived in a little town that was close to the ocean in Northern California, and I discovered an abandoned well. And in that well, it was a trap for snakes, and I was just fascinated by snakes. So a little friend and I, Danny, would lower one of us into the well, and then we would catch these snakes and hand them up to the other person, and then and I was hooked for life. Danny, we would spend our days basically fishing in the morning and catching snakes in the afternoon. And Danny has stayed in that town and is a professional fisherman now. And I work on snakes. So it's been a long road, and I was from the West, and actually these are some of my students, actually, and we're hamming it up here out West with one of our research sites. So some of my interests that I'm going to talk to you about today, one is on amphibian decline, and we've been looking at frogs in Suriname, and now we're starting in French Guiana. I'll talk to you about that. Also, climate change. I'm interested in, of course, the influence of warming temperatures on reptiles, and I'm going to talk to you about that in lizards. But here, and we're going to go to Arizona for that. And I'm working on turtles here in Virginia, right by Virginia State University, with a graduate student. If I have time, I'll talk to you about that. And I also am interested, again, we've discovered here in Virginia that introduced species of turtles, a red-eared slider, which is a turtle that was in the pet trade, has gotten into the various rivers and is interbreeding with our native species, which are called yellow-bellied sliders. If I have time, I'll talk to you about that. But let's go and look at frogs first. So there's a fungus that's called Chytrid fungus that is basically has spread around the world, and it's considered to be it's had more impact on amphibian populations and extinctions than any other cause, except probably habitat destruction. But this fungus essentially grows on their skin, and because amphibians use cutaneous respiration, they're essentially exchanging oxygen, carbon dioxide through their skin. This fungus essentially screws that process up and ultimately ends up smothering them. And as I said, it's spread all over the world. And in South America, it's been found in 10 of 13 countries. This is an outdated map, but basically where those little dots are that you can see, these are countries where Chytrid fungus has been reported. And so let me take you from the United States down to South America. And the country we're going to go to is Suriname. And I don't know if you can see my pointer, but this blue country right here that is sandwiched between Guyana and French Guiana is Suriname. And Chytrid fungus has been found in French Guiana, which is separated from Suriname by a river. It's been found in Brazil, Venezuela, Colombia, and so on. In Guyana, it's only people sampled frog from one location and they didn't find it. So we don't really know whether it's there or not. But I had a project where actually, I didn't tell you, the truth is I'm a behavioral ecologist. I'm really interested in mating systems And so I wanted to go and initially went to Suriname to look at poison arrow frogs, where males and females carry their tadpoles on their backs. And I was interested in genetics of this system and also energy. But in the process, we thought, well, no one had sampled to see if Chytrid fungus was in Suriname. So we thought we would do it. So we basically tried to hit the areas around, this is the capital. And I think just the main takeaway from this map is these little dots are cities, but you can see, or towns, that the vast majority of Suriname doesn't have human habitation. And in fact, I'm going to take you on a little trip there. We crisscrossed the country, and basically everywhere we went, we would sample for the Chytrid fungus, and I'll show you some pictures of that in a second. I just want to show you, it looks like here is Ivan swimming in kind of a remote river we're in, and here's Paige probably telling Ivan, you need to get out of the water. And here's Paige 5 minutes later with a piranha she caught right where actually Ivan and I were swimming out here, and they weren't bothering us, but she caught a piranha, which was delicious. We ate it. And again, here's Paige and Kayla. And I just want to point out, I told you I was interested in reptiles since I was a little kid. I also lived in New York City until I was 9. And the snake I always wanted to see was this snake here, which is this is a baby, but this is an anaconda. And what's unjust about this picture is both Paige and Kayla had never held a snake in their life before. And they get to hold, I've wanted to see this snake for my whole life. And finally we find one, and that's the first snake they ever held. So when I take students, I typically take from 2 to 4 students, and we're doing research, and sometimes the accommodations are, deluxe. And so here's Dallas getting into a hammock for the first time. Okay. We actually had adventures where we were in the jungle and we had these hammocks up in basically little lean-tos, and the whole lean-to collapsed on us. So there's technique for it. But let me take you out looking for Chytrid fungus in a very remote location. So what we're going to do is fly from Paramaribo, the capital, all the way across the country. And you leave Paramaribo, and 3 minutes later, there's nothing but unbroken rainforest, until finally we got to this little village, Kwamala Masutu, which has a little dirt landing strip. And from there, it'll be a little hard to see, but there's a river that goes off through the rainforest, and basically it becomes smaller and smaller. And we are going to look, not only, we're trying to sample frogs everywhere, but there's a frog that is a poison arrow frog, the blue poison arrow frog, Dendrobates tinctorius, that is only found in 3 little isolated oases of jungle that I'm going to show you. And we were curious because it hadn't been described 50 years ago, 25 years ago. 20 people from the Baltimore Aquarium went there, but basically we were wondering if it was still there, because people in the pet trade have illegally collected them. Chytrid fungus could have killed them. So we wanted to see if the frog was there and to sample. So we hopped on a small plane, and I just point out that Raween Jaram, who's from the University of Suriname, who I collaborate with. And back in here, it's hard to see, is Dr. Widiak, who is here at Virginia State University, who was working, we all collaborated on this, and she was working on plants and ant galls. So we flew, and this is just unbroken rainforest. I'm just showing you the last couple of seconds. And we landed in Kwamala Masutu, which is probably back in here. And then we took canoes I'll show you in a minute. And what we were doing is trying to get out to, this is savanna, and then where I have the pointer are these little pockets of rainforest that have been isolated for about 10,000 years. So this is grass, but it's been burned by indigenous people. But it took us 3 days, this is Kwamala, to go up the river in these canoes to reach this site. It's uninhabited, and we tromped through the savanna and we came to these little pockets of rainforest, and here was the frog. We did find the frog. It's a beautiful frog. And we then take a Q-tip and you rub it on the frog and rub it on his belly, rub it on his feet, rub it on his hands, and ultimately then we take it and put it in alcohol to preserve it and send it to a lab which looks for the presence of Chytrid fungus. So this was just a graph one of the students made previously showing a number of the different species of frogs that we sampled, and we ended up sampling about 350 frogs of 37 different species, and none of them tested positive for Chytrid fungus. So where we're going from here is we want to go into French Guiana, maybe Brazil and Guyana, and see if we can track where the fungus is, and try and figure out a timetable perhaps for when it might hit Suriname, so we could take proactive measures to protect frogs. Like that blue poison arrow frog is only found in those 3 little forest islands that are just a few acres in size each. That's the only place on the planet. All right, let me switch gears here. And so here is something about climate change. And we're going to look at elevation and lizards. So basically, high elevation forms are the most imperiled for of different types of plants and animals. Being at a high elevation is considered to put you at the greatest risk. Specifically with lizards, it's thought that maybe about 40% of lizard populations and number of species will be extinct by 2080. And Scoloperin, which are spiny lizards, a genus that I'm interested in, predicted that about 58% of these populations will be extinct. This is actually a group that's found in the United States and Mexico that will be extinct by 2080. The question is why? And first, on elevation, the idea is that if you're adapted for a certain temperature and it's getting warmer, if you can go up a mountain in elevation, it's a little cooler. So you would move up. The problem is high elevation species can't go any higher. And there are a lot of other problems with that. For lizards, the idea is, well, you'd think they're ectotherms. They're getting their heat from the environment. So you'd think they would like that. But it turns out that females are avoiding the excessive heat. As it's getting warmer, there's an optimum temperature for digestion and carrying out your physiological functions. You get above that, you go in the shade. So females are spending more time in the shade as it's getting warmer. They're not producing enough eggs and populations are declining. So this is part of a presentation one of my students did, and this was at the beginning when we started looking at the lizard, and we looked at something called Bergmann's rule. And the idea is this, is that you go further north, or if you go higher in elevation, it gets cooler. And it turns out that animals that are at higher elevations or in cooler temperatures tend to be larger, and this is typical in mammals. And the idea is this decrease in the surface to volume ratio does this. So if you're a certain size and your skin, essentially here we're trying to show surface area to volume, is a 3-to-1 ratio, let's say. If you double the size, the volume inside you is actually increasing as a cube measure versus the surface, which is a square. And so you're ending up, your surface is getting smaller for the amount of volume you have. And this is one of the problems that elephants have. They have very little skin for the amount of bulk they have, so they really have to, they're subject to overheating, they have huge ears, and they have to use other tactics so that they can stay cooled off. So with Bergman's rule is, the idea is you go further north where you want to maintain your temperature. If you have a bigger body, you have less skin, you lose heat less rapidly. So in mammals, there's a lot of support for this, and this is a koala bear in Australia, and these are just the size of koalas at different temperatures. And this block is just trying to show a smaller size and getting larger as the temperature is getting warmer and, I'm sorry, getting colder and colder. And so they're getting larger with a decrease in temperature. And the same thing's happening here in, on the East Coast in Virginia. Here's a blue-gray warbler. And if you go from basically Florida up towards Canada, the birds are getting larger. Again, smaller surface area, larger bulk keeps you warmer. But what about lizards? Well, we thought we'd look at lizards. So we looked at these high and low elevation populations. And here's a grassland, and this is in Arizona. And here's a grassland, and we're looking at a lizard called Scolopus slaveni, the bunchgrass lizard. And here's the bunchgrass that they occur in. And oh, there's a lizard. Oh, so you can see the lizard there. They're kind of cryptic, but you know, they occur in this bunchgrass. And the truth is, we usually do not see the lizard until we scare it. Now, I know it's still hard for you to see, but there's a little lizard there. And typically, we don't see them until we scare them. And then the trick is to try and catch them. And so we have a couple of my students here, and we're at a research station in southeastern Arizona run by the Museum of Natural History. We're up at the top of the mountain, and we're surrounding, there's one lizard there that we're surrounding. 4 students. The lizard is Rheissa's on the left there. It's got her hand, and everybody is, see Cameron's hand sticking out a little bit. The lizard's between Rheissa, and then there's Joe in the back. And the lizard's right in front of them. 4 people. No lizard. Well, there was a lizard. So these, all right. So the funny thing is that lizard, these lizards are amazing. They just dive into the grass, they give you the slip, but you can catch them. And here's a little female. You can see they're a pretty small lizard. We do things like take their snout vent length, how big they are. We take a bunch of other measurements, take the location of the lizard. This is Ivan, who put together by the beginning of the presentation. Here's a low elevation or moderate elevation site. I just want to show you sun shining, a sort of a warm site. Then we go up here to the top of the mountain, the Huachuca Mountains. And here's higher elevation. And then you can get clouds moving in, and it becomes very cold. And the higher elevation is typically, here's another mountain range. These high elevations are cooler than the low elevations. So Sonoita Plain, San Rafael Valley, west side of the Huachucas are considerably warmer than on average, than our 2 mountains, the Chiricahuas and Huachucas. And it turns out, we look at snout vent length, that's from the tip of the nose to the vent where lizards mate and go to the bathroom, where they have the reproductive organs. You can see that, in fact, we have larger lizards at warmer temperatures and smaller lizards snout vent length at cooler temperatures. This is the converse to Bergman's rule. It's exactly the opposite of what Bergman was suggesting. So the question is, well, why might that be the case? Well, there are a lot of explanations, but one would be if you think of ectotherms, which are animals like lizards and insects, fishes, that typically get their heat from the environment. A lizard that's at a higher elevation theoretically should want to heat up more rapidly, because if you saw that picture with all the fog and it's cool out there, it pays for a lizard to be able to heat up so that it can digest its food more rapidly. And if it has a smaller body size, that in fact might help it do so. However, and we're trying to test this hypothesis right now, because although in general, larger animals, larger sizes take more to heat up, we want to test it on the lizards. Dr. Kaslow, who's a physiologist here at the Virginia State, and some of our students, we take a lizard and we put him in a little glass vial here, and she has a little thermocouple in her cloaca that's recording her temperature. And here's Cameron and Reyesa. And what they're doing is looking at oxygen consumption. And what we're finding out is, well, we're working on this now, actually. What it looks like is that both that smaller lizards are heating up more rapidly than the larger lizards. So this is not earth-shaking, but then with this, we can think about how this might affect the lizards at high and low elevation. And what I'm doing with a graduate student now, too, is we're actually trying to determine if this is one species that I showed you, bunchgrass lizards, and we're trying to determine if they both are physiologically at the optimum for their abilities to digest food and to do things like escape behavior from predators at the same temperatures. So whether they're actually physiologically conservative in that they are, even if they're at a high elevation, the best temperature for them is the same temperature as the lizards at the low elevation. So it's fixed genetically and physiologically, or whether there's been enough time between the populations at the bottom of the mountain and the top of the mountain so that the ones at the bottom are adapted for that temperature and the ones at the top are adapted for the other. Depending on what we find out, this has a number of repercussions for the ability of these lizards to survive in the future. So what I'm going to do is open this up to questions, and I'm happy to talk about the other projects. I'll show you this one picture. I like this one here, a student of mine, Kirsten. And this I use for recruiting when I'm trying to get students to come with me on the trips and to do research. I explain that, well, we'll pay for your airfare and we'll pay for your lodging, but we don't pay for your food. And so Kirsten, unfortunately, she just didn't budget correctly. And of course I could have shared my food with her, but it's more important that you really learn to take these things seriously and to be responsible. So I didn't share any food with Kirsten, and here she is. She happened to find this is a javelina in Arizona, and luckily she found it, so she's going to be able to eat for the next week. So typically, and I'm telling you, I tell this to university students, and the majority of them think that I'm serious. That poor Kirsten. Then I asked them, okay, who wants to sign up now to work with me? And they're all thinking, my God. All right. So any questions? Yeah. Or I can tell you about other projects.
Yeah, we have a couple questions. So we have one question.
Oh, I have to look at your.
Oh, no, don't worry about it. I'll just ask them and you can. I have a question here. If you could sort of contrast between Berman's rule and Allen's rule, and then sort of comment if you've done any research about that, or if it plays into your research.
Theoretically, in fact, you would think that both. Well, if we have the converse, that if you're trying to heat more rapidly, which theoretically the lizards at higher altitudes should be trying to, then you would think that there would be a contrast there and that they wouldn't be following Allen's rule as well. The thing I didn't say about this is there's also another reason, of course, that possibly that the lizards could be smaller at higher elevations, and that's simply that food availability is less. These lizards are active apparently almost all year round, and it does get, but the ones at the high elevation where it snows are going to be less active for the number of days that they can be active year round. Also during the day, it's cooler in the morning and it takes longer to actually get warmer there. So there may be less period for foraging availability when you're at high elevation than when you're at low elevation. So you would presumably have a smaller body size. So one of the other things we're trying to do with the physiological measurements and figuring out in terms of oxygen consumption is to ultimately figure out the number of calories and kilocalories that lizards would need to sustain their activities and body weight, and to see essentially, because these guys are all insectivores eating insects, and there are studies on the amount of energy that different types of insects have stored, or we can do that. And then we would see essentially how many insects you would need to eat during the day, and ultimately how many hours you would have to be active to see if that's, you know, a constraining factor as well.
Oh, okay, awesome. Thank you. So, and then another question is regarding the fungus. What are the most highly impacted populations, and why is the impact on those populations so detrimental?
Okay, so, well, it's detrimental in that a number of species have gone extinct now because it ultimately it can kill the frogs. So that's why, I mean, this is so serious. What isn't known, but it looks like people are trying to figure out, okay, well, some species, actually in Virginia, a number of species have Chytrid fungus, or it's found in different species here as well, and in the United States. There seem to be a number of species where it doesn't seem to affect them at all, impact them. So what it's looking like, so why does it affect some species and not others? And they think now, the research is zeroing in on that there are bacterial assemblages on their skin. So there's bacteria on the skin that may be essentially protecting the species, certain species, from the invasion by the fungus. So there may be some sort of interaction with bacteria essentially competing for space or being able to prevent those fungi from growing there. So that appears to be the maybe right now the most promising information on why some species would get it and why others wouldn't.
Okay, awesome, thank you. Let me see what check. And then, okay, so another question is, well, the lizard, whether or not it's been enough time to really be able to determine, you know, if some of those things you're seeing are true. I guess I wanted to know more about how would you go about figuring that out?
Asking whether, if we're trying to figure out whether there are differences genetically versus just environmentally, as saying in determining, even though they're interconnected, whether the lizards are stuck at a certain metabolic temperature that's optimum for them, or whether it has been, and whether this is for the species. So let's just say that for the whole species, there's an optimum temperature, and it doesn't matter whether you're at the top of them, what temperature you're at. And let me just also back up and say that both the lizards at the top of the mountain and down below, there's an overlap in the temperatures during the day, at least on most days. Although again, in the winter and at certain times there won't be. But so I just want to say that the lizards at the top of the mountain can get to 32 degrees C or whatever it happens to be as an optimum temperature for part of the day, just like the lizards down below. So if they're set for that, that's one possibility, right? The other is because it's usually about 2 to 4 degrees C cooler at the top of the mountain on average, then maybe if their temperatures were set for that, would have implications for what the range of temperatures are they could survive at. So the way we wanted to try to test it was simply, again, using the little chambers that I showed you with the lizards in little glass vial. By measuring their respiration rates at different temperatures, what we can determine is for those different populations, whether they both have an optimal rate where the respiration rates are the same, or whether it gets too hot or too cool, whether it's changing. We're also trying to test the difference. I didn't show you this, but males and females are sexually dimorphic in size. So the males are almost a quarter to a third smaller than females. And also gravid females with eggs in them are considerably larger. So we're trying to test all of the different sizes as well in the different populations to see if one sex is more, has different respiration rates. Females maybe because they have eggs are going to prefer different temperatures and so on. So that's how we're going to try and get at whether these temperatures are physiologically fixed or not. And what I feel is that if it turns out that the lizards at low elevations and high elevations both have an optimal temperature for respiration, let's say it's 32 degrees C. In terms of climate change, we already know the lizards in the low elevation are warmer in general, and they're exposed to a warmer temperature for more hours of the day, more days of the year, and the temperatures can be considerably warmer there. But if the ones at the top of the mountain are still physiologically similar in terms of respiration to the ones at the bottom, what that means is that they're going to have a buffer in terms of, since the lizards at the bottom of the mountain are still doing okay, the ones at the top are going to have a buffer in terms of how warm it can get on the top of the mountain before we'd start seeing perhaps population declines or adverse effects from the temperature. And again, it gives them a bigger latitude, and right now the ones at the bottom are still, even though temperatures are increasing, are still doing okay. So the guys at the top are theoretically in really good shape, and this is counter to what other people are typically finding, where at the top of the mountain you can't go up any higher to get cooled off, and it has detrimental effects on them. If, on the other hand, there has been adaptation in a long enough period of time and there's not gene flow between the lizards at the top and the bottom, this is another part of our study which we don't know the answer to yet, but we're trying to see basically how long potentially these populations have been separated, or when the last period of time, or if there's current gene flow between populations. But if they have been separated and the optimum temperature for respiration at the top of the mountain where it's cooler is such and such a temperature that's lower than at the bottom, then if they're sort of fixed like that, we'd assume that if temperatures rise, that the lizards, you know, at the top of the mountain, which cannot go any higher to cool off, will end up becoming you know, negatively impacted and potentially extinct first.
Awesome, thank you. No, that was very much the question I was trying to ask.
Okay.
So thank you for taking my very poorly worded question, not a lot of information, and being able to figure out the question that I was trying to ask. So let me see. So that's all we have for questions. Thank you so very much. I personally won't speak for myself, but I love behavioral ecology presentations in general. I feel like they teach us so much about how we do research like this, and how we can sort of try to make connections between what we see and what's going on sort of on that more like biological, you know, smaller scale. So if we were in a room of people, we'd all clap for you. So thank you very much.